Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Taylor Hughes. I'm a faculty member in the Condensed Matter Theory group here, and I'm going to be chairing this session. For some reason, they gave me the grave responsibility of making sure you get to lunch on time. Maybe because I'm younger, they don't expect me to fall asleep, but we'll see how we do. So the first speaker today is going to be one of our own faculty members, Professor Nigel Goldenfeld, who's a part of our great Condensed Matter Theory group, as well as the Institute for Universal Biology associated with IGB on campus. And today he's going to talk about, is there universality in biology?
Patience. So you can learn a lot from Tony Leggett. And one of the many things that I've learned from Tony Leggett is that it's a great idea to tackle the hardest problems that there are around. It's a duty and a responsibility of theorists to try to do that. And so I'm going to talk today about perhaps the ultimate challenge in this area, namely the task of looking for universality in biology. Because as we all know, biology is full of exceptions, and so to try to look for universality in biology might be viewed as a fool's errand, but let's see how far we can go. Pardon? Can somebody make the sound louder? I don't know. I have a microphone, and it seems to be on and deafening to me. Well, I've been trying to do that for the last 35 years, and it's failed conspicuously.
Your English accent does very nicely, thank you.
All right. So one of the things that you can learn from Tony is, of course, the theory of helium-3, and as encapsulated in this wonderful review article from 1975. But the other thing that you can learn from this is how to write articles and what happens when you do. So the thing is that really I learned from Tony very early on when I was a postdoc at KITP, and I first met Tony in person, was the striving to understand very sophisticated theoretical results in intuitive and physical languages. And here in this introduction to his review article, Tony points out that he was trying to describe the spin fluctuation theory of helium-3 pairing, and was faced with the alternatives of presenting it in diagrammatic perturbation theory language or trying to reformulate it in more elementary language. So that's a very noble goal. Now, the other thing that you find when you try to do these things as you write papers is they don't always work out the way that you expect. So what happened in this particular instance is that, unfortunately, a few days before the final deadline for submission, I discovered that I'd made a trivial algebraic mistake, and that, in fact, the results of the elementary method, as given, are not equivalent to those of the original papers, although the difference is only an overall numerical factor. So one of the things that you learn from this is that even the very best people, when they are writing about a topic that they know extremely well, can sometimes face the vagaries of research that we all know and encounter and perhaps love. The other thing that you can learn from this paper is how to get out of such a trap, how to do weasel words. And the most important thing is to make an escape that is elegant. And Tony points out that he didn't have time to work this out in detail. Such is the nemesis visited by field-theoretic methods on those that scorn them. You won't find that in Landau and Lifshitz. So I want to talk now about universality in biology. And first, let's talk about, is there universality in physics? So as we heard in the last session, one of the interesting questions that has perplexed people and vexed Tony as well is the issue of amorphous materials at low temperatures. Why are they so similar? And here you see a figure from Justin Freeman and Ansel Anderson's paper from '86, where you see that the raw data can be collapsed in these two different temperature regimes. And I think it's fair to say that the understanding of universality here is still not well understood. Here's an example that, of course, is much better understood, and perhaps one closer to my heart, and that is the scaling laws that happen near second-order phase transitions. So here, for example, is the magnetization, ostensibly a function of two variables, but plotted in appropriate scaling variables, falls onto a universal curve. And here are data from 5 different magnetic materials. and then plotted all together in the way that theory predicts, and then the solid line is the theoretical calculation from the 3D Heisenberg model, and this all works extremely well. So we are very used now to the idea that there's universality in physics. So what we see here is something really remarkable. A model, the 3D Heisenberg model, gives a very precise prediction of exponents and scaling functions in agreement with experiment. But actually it's more complicated than that. Because what we're really seeing is a model of a model of a model of a model of a model giving a precise prediction in agreement with experiment. And the interesting thing here is that we start off at the lowest level with quantum chemistry. Then we go up to electronic structure. Then we make a quantum Heisenberg model, then a classical Heisenberg model, and then Landau theory, and you compute. And it all works. All of these stages are non-systematic approximations, and yet you get a result that is as precise as we possibly know in physics. So this is really remarkable and perhaps gives us a clue as to why it's possible to even do physics in the first place. So here are the questions I want to talk about. First of all, do we learn new physics when we study biological physics, or is it just insanely complicated soft material science? Secondly, what are the universal phenomena in biology? Are there actually any? And we'll see that there are. And do they reveal anything important? Yes, I think they do, and we'll see why that's the case. And in particular, what do we miss by not understanding universal phenomena? And I'm going to end the talk by making a comparison with the theory of superconductivity, where I think there's a very appropriate analogy that can be made. So let's start off then with our quest to try to understand universal biology, the idea that there's some universal laws of biological systems. Now, what do we know about universal biology? Well, pretty much nothing, but here's an example of why we need it. So this is a headline that was in the news a couple of years ago, the mystery of the missing waves on Titan. Titan has these lakes of liquid ammonia, and we know from the equations of fluid mechanics that we ought to be able to see waves, we ought to be able to calculate exactly what the wavelength and amplitude is, but we didn't see them, and so there was a mystery of the fact that they were missing. But no worries, because a few years later, or maybe a year later or so, Cassini, the wonderful satellite from NASA and the ESA, spies the wind-rippled waves on Titan, so everything is fine. So that's how science is supposed to work. Here's a headline that you didn't see. Mystery of the missing life on Titan. And one that you really didn't see, at least unless I missed it, or maybe it's for tomorrow, April 1st, Cassini spies the long-sought life on Titan. Now, why is one of these headlines serious science and one of them a joke? Well, the reason is this. We understand why we should see waves and so on Titan, because we understand the universal laws of fluid mechanics, but we don't really have any understanding of the universal laws of life that would tell us whether we should expect life elsewhere, and if so, what its characteristics and biosignatures would be. So this joke represents an aspiration. So what do we know about universal biology? Well, everything that we know is pretty much shown on this slide here. Given that, let's change the subject a little bit, move the goalposts, and talk about something where we do know something, and that is universal computation. Now, we know a lot about universal computation, and for example, here is a picture of a computer, a nice piece of plastic and silicon and liquid crystals and so on and so forth, and we all recognize what that is. On the other hand, this thing might not seem to be a candidate for a computer. It's made out of cog wheels and springs, and nevertheless, it is indeed a fully functioning computer, and you can see it operating at the Science Museum in London or at the Museum of Computation in Mountain View. These two things are, in fact, equivalent. Why are they equivalent? Because they're both the realization of a mathematical concept, an abstract concept, namely a Turing machine with a von Neumann architecture, but they're instantiated in different ways. In one case with modern-day electronics and liquid crystals and so on and so forth. In Babbage's case, in Charles Babbage's case from the 19th century, cogwheels, levers, and springs. So the point is that the medium is not the message. Here we have a computer, Here we have another computer. Here's another computer. This is the first, if you like, modern computer. This is John von Neumann standing in front of the MANIAC, the first real computer that was built at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, primarily to solve problems, hydrodynamics problems related to hydrogen bombs. So if you want to look in biology for new physical laws, are there any? So Schrodinger and Delbruck were the perhaps earliest physicists to work in biology, and their motivation was to find new physical laws, and they thought they would find them in violations of quantum mechanics. But I don't think that that's really where we would see such laws, and most people today would not think that that is a sensible motivation, although indeed there are some claims that quantum mechanics does apply even in room temperature biology. But where would such new laws of physics apply? Well, my answer is it's in the emergence and the existence of life itself. And I'm going to try to explain that in this talk. Namely, the question is, how does matter self-organize hierarchically to create replicating evolvable structures? How do molecules come to life? We don't really have an understanding of why this is possible, even in principle. And so to understand biology in the same sense that we understand physical phenomena, such as superconductivity, we need to understand not just the specific realization of it, but the existence. And so what I told you up to now was we can think of systems, biological systems, as being instantiated in different ways. By giving an example from computers, I want to think of living systems in that same way. Now, what is the fundamental aspect of living systems? And I would claim it's the dynamics of systems that can program themselves. If, Tony, you'll excuse the grammatical error here, which is deliberate because it's more, it rolls off the tongue better, fits on a bumper sticker. The program is the data is the program. Life is a system where the computer program takes itself as the data and changes it as it goes along. And the first person who really understood this was Niels Baricelli, who was working at the Institute for Advanced Study in the evenings when John von Neumann's hydrogen bomb engineers went home. He would sneak into the computer and he would run the first versions of what we would now today call computer viruses or digital life, programming systems that could rewrite themselves as they went along and looking for the epiphenomena of living systems, which he indeed was able to do in a very crude and simple way. So the point about self-programming systems is this. They replicate the idea that living systems have the capacity to evolve. And evolving systems can reprogram themselves and so are able to respond to perturbations by creating new functionality. And that is something that is very different from physical systems, which have a fixed or predetermined equation of motion. In some sense, and I'm not going to have time to talk about why I think this is true, the future state of an evolvable system is inherently unpredictable and may even be Gödel undecidable. And this is the feature that makes it very difficult to control evolving systems, such as biological systems, but even systems that behave like living systems, such as, for example, financial markets. Now, when we talk about biology and we ask, well, what do biologists do? They actually are solving the inverse problem. The inverse problem is this. Suppose you were given a modern-day computer, like the one I'm using right now. If you just came down from Mars and you saw this computer, would you be able to realize that this is, in fact, a representation of the abstract theory of computation instantiated in silicon and liquid crystals and electronics? Very, very difficult. In biology, we have that inverse problem. The biology is already created and highly advanced, and we want to understand what is the abstract theory of which it is the instantiation, and that abstract theory is what one would like to have, which would underlie all systems that exhibit the characteristics of life. Now, what is universal about biology? And I want to now go through a couple of examples just to show you that there really are solid examples here. So here's one that's dear to my heart. This is the universal genetic code. This is what enables us to do genetic engineering because all organisms on the planet have the same genetic code. You basically read this table. This is the first nucleotide base on the DNA or the messenger RNA. This is the second, and this is the third position. And then from where you are in this table, you read what amino acid is going to be inserted into the protein that is being coded for. So, for example, U, and then U codes for phenylalanine, and so on and so forth. So that's the genetic code, and it's universal. Most of you know that. But what you may not know is that it is also optimal in minimizing the effects of errors. This code is not just something random that was inherited by us from the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth. It actually has clearly evolved. And how do we know that? Well, you can make alternative genetic codes, for example, here, by permuting the labels. There's 20 factorial, which is about 10 to the 18 possible different genetic codes you can envisage. And then what you can do is you can find a way to score these codes to ask how good they are at minimizing errors. And the errors that we're talking about are these. Suppose that I have a mutation, or there's a mistake in the translational machinery that turns the messenger RNA into proteins, and you get the wrong amino acid. If that wrong amino acid is very different in chemical properties from the one that you're supposed to have, you will then get a protein that will misfold and it won't function. So what you would really like to do if you wanted to do the best intelligent design that you could would be to take the table and structure it so that under the most likely errors that you're going to make, if you get the wrong amino acid, it's going to be chemically as close as possible to the one that you should have got. And when I say chemically as close as possible, that's a long discussion about what is the metric that you use here, and I don't have time to go into that. Suffice it to say that you can do that, and this is testable, because what you do is a big Monte Carlo simulation of all the genetic codes. You score them, you plot the probability distribution of the scores, and then you ask, what do I get? So here, for example, this is what you would get from doing a random selection of codes, and then if the actual genetic code is somewhere in the middle here, scored with this value, then you would conclude that the code is just some frozen accident inherited from some last universal common ancestor. On the other hand, if you get a result like this, it says that these are the random codes, this is what the real genetic code is doing, and therefore something has optimized the actual genetic code. So the x-axis is a measure of how good the code is at minimizing errors. And I'm not going to have time to explain to you how one computes it. Okay, it's very technical. Okay, so here's the result of when you actually do this. This was first done convincingly by Freeland and Hurst in 1998. This is what you get from the random codes. This is what you have for the actual genetic code. It's very far away from what you would get at random. The probability of getting this code, the one that we actually have, is about 1 part in 10 to the 8 or 1 part in 10 to the 9. How did it get that way? So what we discovered was, with working with Carl Rose and my student Colin Verzigian, was a way to actually compute the dynamics of the evolution of the genetic code. And again, I don't have time to go into the details of that. Suffice it to say, it's a model in which as the genetic code, as organisms evolve in complexity, the requirements for the genetic code to be more and more precise become more and more stringent. So simple organisms don't require very much of their proteins, and so you can make mistakes and nothing bad happens. Complicated organisms like us need very highly refined codes, so there's very little errors that happen, and the two things can co-evolve together. The organisms can co-evolve with the code, and the end result of that is that you find that as you run a computer simulation showing the quality of the code as a function of time, what you find is you get these two graphs here. Now this one in red is what happens when you run a simulation with using the usual vertical Darwinian evolution that we're used to, and what you see is that you don't get a unique genetic code, and also you don't get a code that is distinguishable from what you would get at random. The blue curves allow the organisms in this computer simulation, this digital life simulation, similar to the one that Niels Baricelli ran all those years ago in Institute for Advanced Study. In this one, the organisms are allowed to swap genes, even the genes that allow the translational machinery to be established, even the genes that allow the identity of organisms as species to be established. And when you have this horizontal gene transfer, as it's called, you see that you get a single code. You don't get a multiplicity of codes. And every time you run the experiment, you get a single code, and it is much more optimal than the codes you get at random. And so you learn that horizontal transfer leads to optimality. And this then tells you that there's a picture now of what happens to the evolution of life, because it says, well, as a function of time, this is, when you are here, somewhere in this leaf over here, these are the 3 domains of life. This is the last universal common ancestor, and somewhere back here, evolution worked not by vertical transfer of genes, but by horizontal transfer. And the end result of that is that you have a network of life rather than a tree of life. And this transition is really the mother of all phase transitions. It's a transition between a very early state of life, which was fully collective and communal, to one that is more individual like this. And this makes testable predictions, which I don't have time to go into, looking for the effects of horizontal gene transfer on the translational machinery itself, and one can study those things using modern genomics. Here's another example I want to tell you about, which is homochirality. Now, we've seen this picture once before in the talk, I think from Jim Sauls. This is left and right-handed enantiomers. What happens in biology is even though for amino acids you could have both left and right, in fact you only get the left-handed ones. And this is a 100% effect. It's not simply an enantiomeric excess, a small excess. It's a really 100% effect. And there's an explanation for that arises from looking at the proliferation of possibly chiral autocatalytic self-replicators in early life. And again, I don't have time to go into how one does these calculations and makes these models. It's a model, a very simple minimal model of life as a non-equilibrium process, but able to replicate autocatalytically. The important thing about it is that there is no symmetry breaking. If you like, the potential for the chiral order parameter omega has a single minimum in the racemic state, a state where there is no chirality, and yet you actually do get chiral symmetry breaking. And here is an example. This is a simulation. This is space. This is time. This is a population of organisms. And what's happening is the red is the right-handed, the blue is the left-handed. And as you evolve in time, what happens is you get domains of left and right alternating until eventually one phase wins. And how this happens, it's a non-equilibrium autocatalysis, and it achieves this chiral symmetry breaking, not through spontaneous symmetry breaking, but because the attractor is a state that minimizes the intrinsic reaction noise, which turns out to be multiplicative and not additive. So that's the crucial thing here. So this is a population effect, again, a symmetry breaking occurring through a rather novel mechanism. Now,
stop you there.
not too long, I hope, please.
The crucial thing is the multiplicative.
The crucial thing is the noise is multiplicative. In all population processes, it's not that you just sort of write down some average equation and then add some noise. You have to literally compute it from the chemical master equation, and that's the crucial thing. Now let's look at gene expression. Suppose you take genetically identical cells. What you find is they exhibit different protein copy numbers. That's something known as stochastic gene expression. Now, protein copy numbers are not thermodynamically large, so cell biology probes a limit of statistical mechanics when number fluctuations are large. Now, if you look at these patterns in data, so I'm now going to show you data from yeast and E. coli populations where we can do these experiments very well. This is the probability density function for the protein copy numbers for a variety of different biological systems listed here. This is data from Hannah Salmon's lab. And you can see that all these data fall onto one universal curve, and moreover, that the variance scales with the mean squared. So which is quite the opposite of what you would expect if these things were normally distributed. And you can also do this for single cell measurements. You take 70 generations and look at the protein copy number, and again you see the same universal curve. The scaling is interesting here because the variance is going like the mean squared. And this is what you would get if you have some kind of extreme value distributions present in the mechanism for gene expression. So the interpretation, which again I don't have time to go into, but here are some references, is protein production has some kind of negative feedback control consistent with models of cell growth arising through interacting networks of reactions. So there's there is universality there, and it behooves us to try to understand where it comes from. I'm going to skip this one, although it's very interesting. I want to go on to my next topic, which is universality useful? So my first answer is, yes, it is. Here's the first universal scaling law in biology that I know of, and this is a scaling law in ecology. So in England, people are very interested in nature, in flowers and birds and so on, and so these are data from 1859 showing the number of plant species as a function of area, and there's similar data for birds and things like this. And what you see is some representation of a power law, and if you do this more carefully, and this has now been done on scales from centimeters up to continent size, what you find is that the number of species that live inside a given area, as you increase the area, you see more and more species. It's a representation of the statistical properties of ecology, scales roughly as the 1/4 power of the area. And this is very important because this is how we estimate climate-related extinction risk. If you read in the New York Times tomorrow, in the last week or so, because of the burning of the Amazon rainforest, 25,000 species went extinct. Nobody went out and counted them. They used these scaling laws to make those sorts of extrapolations. So that's one answer, yes. The other answer is universality is not useful. So here's another example, again, a scaling law in ecology. This is the Barra Colorado Island near Panama, and it has lots of trees. Each one of those trees has been extensively studied, and every single one is known. And we can compute the species abundance distribution. We can measure it, a fraction of species with a given number of individuals, and there are some of the data. Now you could ask, how does it get like that? What theory governs this? Well, one theory is that you say, well, there's various ecological niches, the organisms have to find the right nutrients, and so on and so forth, and you can come up with a model that would predict what that would be based on the organisms inhabiting different niches, and that's one of these curves shown here. But you could also say, no, there's nothing like that at all. The trees are basically functionally equivalent. Every tree does the same thing. There's nothing different about them. So we can make a kind of ideal gas model of species in an ecosystem. And when you do that, you get the other curve here. Well, I can't tell them apart. So what that means is that the upside of universality is that you can make predictions based on the minimal model, but the downside is that statistically similar results obtained from microscopic models can be different in their assumptions. In other words, a minimal model gives predictions that are universal, and therefore it precludes you understanding what happens at lower levels of description. So what do we miss if we don't understand universal phenomena? Let's talk about superconductivity. So as everybody here knows, superconductivity was discovered in 1911, the Meister-Ochsenfeld effect in 1933, the discovery of the vortex lattice in 1955, or prediction of it, and 1962 was about the prediction and discovery of Josephson effects. And the question I ask is, why did it take so long to make these discoveries? Because we can derive all of these effects in a few lines of algebra just from the idea that you have off-diagonal long-range order for a charged condensate coupled to electromagnetism. So why did it take so long? Well, the reason is that we were looking at physics in the wrong way. So I want to talk about levels of description in my closing few minutes. So here I'm comparing and contrasting superconductivity with biology. So at the lowest level, you might have, say, quantum chemistry and material science. Then maybe at some intermediate level, the BCS theory for interacting Cooper pairs, if I have a weak coupling superconductor. And then at the most general level, perhaps, say something like the Ginzburg-Landau theory for an order parameter with off-diagonal long-range order coupled to electromagnetism. On the right-hand side, of course, at the lowest level, we have atoms and molecules. We agree not to go lower level than that. In the middle layer, you might have, for example, the elasticity theory for DNA, or the phase transitions between liquid-liquid intracellular complexes, which is now quite the rage in biology. And then at the top level, the dynamics of evolving systems, which I talked about at the beginning. Different levels of description answer different questions. So for example, in superconductivity, the quantum chemistry and material science answers the question of how do you make specific materials and how do they instantiate the BCS pairing mechanism. The BCS theory for interacting Cooper pairs answers the question of what is the basic mechanism for weakly coupled superconductors, and the Ginzburg-Landau level description answers the question, why does the phenomenon of superconductivity exist in the first place? In biology, the same thing. Atoms and molecules tell you how specific biopolymers interact. They fold, undergo template-directed synthesis. The elasticity theory for DNA and so on and so forth answers the questions of what are the basic functional cellular processes. And the dynamics of evolving systems would answer for us the question of why does the phenomenon of life even exist at all? These different levels of description correspond to different levels of universality. In superconductivity, quantum chemistry and material science is valid for specific materials. It's useful for looking at specific materials. BCS theory is very useful for recoupling superconductors, and this sort of general viewpoint really applies to all superconductors. Similarly, over here for biology, if you look at this level of description, it tells you about specific biopolymers, RNA or DNA or whatever. The elasticity theory tells you about the physics of subcellular components, and the dynamics of evolving systems describes all of life. So why do we need this universal level? What goes wrong if we don't have it? Well, this theory applies to all superconductivity, the Ginsburg-Landau off-diagonal long-range order type of description. If you don't have it, then you don't have a way to easily and correctly predict the response to electromagnetic fields. That's why it took so long for the Meissner effect, the vortex lattice, and Josephson effects to be realized as being a phenomenon of superconductivity. In biological systems, our upper level of description is the dynamics of evolving systems, and therefore all of life. And if you don't have that, then that means you're not going to be able to predict the response to selective perturbations. Now, a universal feature of all living systems is that when you try to interfere with them by treating them as engineered physical systems, it goes badly wrong. You take bacterial infections and you try to treat them by saying, okay, we'll just kill the bacteria and we're done. That didn't work. It takes an antibiotic about 5 years to start to become useless because the bacteria globally evolve resistance. Same thing with insecticides. This is what limits the success of chemotherapy, as cancer tumors evolve resistance very, very rapidly. So by regarding superconductors as collections of atoms, only at that level of description, we miss the emergent laws that act at the system scale and govern the large-scale response to electromagnetic fields. But we know how to solve this problem. For biological systems, by just regarding it as complicated physical systems, we're missing the emergent laws that act at the system scale and govern the large-scale response to control perturbations. In biology, we do not know how to solve this problem yet. So there's another problem for Tony to think about. So here's the questions that I started off by talking about, and here are my answers. Do we learn new physics? Yes. Are there universal phenomena in biology? Yes, I gave you a few examples. Do they reveal anything important? Yes, they reveal things like the phase diagram of life, cell structure, and some of the principles of organization. And what do we miss by not understanding universal phenomena? We miss this very important question of how do we think about the right way to respond and control biological systems. As Stan Ulam said, ask not what physics can do for biology, ask what biology can do for physics. In fact, biology opens up a new vista for physics, a kind of universality class of problems that behave very differently from the ones that we're used to. So with that, let me conclude. I want to end, you've seen this picture before. My collaborators in infamy, apart from Tony, was Paul Goldbart over here, and both of us, Tony, wish you a very happy birthday.
Okay, we're a little bit over time, but maybe we have time for a question or two if people have questions.
Tony.
Yeah. Just let's suppose that intelligent life is discovered on some exoplanet, and you have the opportunity of sending your graduate student there to find out about it, but he's only allowed to basically find out the answer to one question about this exolife.
Yes.
Which question would you get into?
So the question was, you get to send a graduate student, I don't know whether it's your best graduate student or your worst graduate student, to a distant planet where intelligent exolife has been discovered, and that student is only allowed to ask the aliens one question. So what would that be? Let's see. What is the answer to homework problem 3 in Tony Leggett's superconductivity course, perhaps? I think that's a difficult question to answer. I suppose the question you could ask is, the graduate student could ask is my existence as perplexing to you as yours is to me? And I think that would be the interesting question. We'd learn if they had a good theory of life. Thank you for the novel question there. All right, anybody else? No.
So is your putative theory of dynamical systems able to tell us how we're supposed to distinguish living from non-living systems?
The question is, does a dynamical systems approach tell us how to distinguish living and non-living? I think the point is that living systems are evolvable. Okay, that's the point. That in other words, that when you try to impose a perturbation on them, they literally change their dynamical system rules, and they do that in a self-referential and infinitely recursive way. And so why is that useful? What it says is, if you want to look at how to deal with, say, a bacterial infection, instead of doing the obvious thing, which is kill the bacteria, what you should be trying to look at is, what is the least evolvable part of the ecosystem of the infection where you can most likely intervene and not provide a stimulus that's going to provoke the evolution of the system. And so you can literally do that. You can start to think about these things in this way. So it's not just a pure BS way of thinking about life. It's actually a way where you can literally start to compute things. And it's also a way where you can try to understand, can dynamical systems, as they evolve levels of hierarchy and levels of feedback loop, do they cross a point where there's enough modularity and levels that they become evolvable and then are able to start the open-ended growth of complexity, which is how we got here. So that's why this viewpoint literally can be mathematized and formalized. One at the back.
So I think it's fair to say that sort of the bigger the system, the more complex it can be.
Not necessarily true. If you look at the genome of pine, the pine tree, it's 35 times as long as our genome. So the size, depending on how you measure size, the size of the genome has nothing to do with the complexity. Similarly, our genome is the same size as that of a worm, C. elegans.
Fine, but E. coli is never going to be as smart as a human.
Well, I don't know. One single E. coli, that's true. But remember that when you talk about you being a human, you have 1 trillion bacteria in your gut. You have many neurons in your gut. There is a connection between the brain and the gut, and we do not know what that connection is doing. So the way to think of a human is as a multicellular zoo on legs. And so, yes, of course, one bacterium on its own, but we are a interacting complex system of many different parts. But anyway, please proceed with your question.
In this context, my question is it clear that going even bigger, sort of combining even more organisms than there are in a human body, can get us even more, I don't know, complexity, intelligence, something?
I don't know, because if you look at, say, societies, you might look at, say, the United States, for example, or Britain, and you have a society composed of many presumably intelligent individuals, but the end result of that collective interaction may not be what you would necessarily regard as intelligent.
Okay, with that, we should probably stop. I'm sorry, we'll stop now. And then, okay, no, so I think we should need to stop. We're already way over time, so.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're done, yep.
Yeah, we're done. Great talk. So let's thank Nigel again.
Using now this input, and maybe you have to change.
That's what I'll ask him. Is HDMI okay?
Okay.
Great, let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Daniel Loss from the University of Basel, and he will today talk about Majorana fermions, facts and fictions.
Okay, thank you very much. I also would like to say, it's a great honor for me to be here. I think I'm very excited and also a little bit nervous because speaking after this British, talent, my English will not be any better. So I wanted to start actually to say a few reminiscences, few words. The first time I got to know Tony was at the conference in Varena in '87, and this was just shortly after discovery of high TC, and there was a huge summer school. Lots of people were talking about high TC, except Tony. Tony gave a lecture series there on macroscopic quantum phenomena, and that was something which I've never encountered, never heard before, and I was totally fascinated. And I thought, if I want to stay in physics and have a career there, or try at least, then I should go to this man. And that's what I did. At that time, no email, no nothing. I didn't even approach Tony at the conference. I just, wrote to him, and then I got back this. And, I opened it, and I had the same impression or feeling as was already described before I think by Claire. I couldn't read it. And it took me several days to find out whether I could go to Tony or not. I was really nervous. And eventually I went through it, and it's actually an incredible letter. Tony wrote that on his sabbatical stay in Madrid, and it went via Urbana, then back to Zurich, and it's 3 pages, and in the beginning there is some administrative advice how to get housing. We never do this now these days, we just say get housing, but Tony was explaining what to do. And then the other 2 pages are some suggestions for problems. And after a few days working through this, here is the list. And this list, I think, is still very topical. You can imagine I didn't know of any topic much, and I was deeply scared to go there and see if I can actually do something with Tony. And it turned out that, for example, the first topic, quantum mechanics of macroscopic variables, was the reason why I wanted to go to Tony. And basically, I could say all my career I stayed with that subject, moved into quantum computing, which is basically the same questions, just a little bit more formal. And I started then to work in Urbana on mesoscopic systems, and I just wanted to show here the paper which I wrote then based on Tony's basically input with Paul Goldbart and Sasha Balatsky here. And I also wanted to show actually this paper. It goes really very way back because of Andrew. We talked yesterday about persistent current. He told me about some very new systems, and I thought, okay, that's a good opportunity to show actually 2 things that we already thought about these things many years back because of Tony. And the second thing is to show how generous Tony was actually when you work with him. So we worked on that, and we used the most complicated and I would say stupid method to solve the problem, namely path integrals. And we had many things to overcome. And then when Tony looked at it, he said, well, you can actually solve the problem exactly. And he basically just gave us the exact solution for a special case to the problem. And this was really first, I was very embarrassed because we didn't see it ourselves. And the second thing was, it was great to have this solution to check then, some special properties, and we found even some mistake in the calculation which you could fix. And then we wrote a paper, and Tony clearly, should be co-author on the paper. Tony said, no. I mean, I'm not. He declined, and I was very shy at that point. And I said, okay, the paper is so bad that Tony doesn't want to put his name on it, and so basically that left out his name. He should have been on it, and I think that's just a sign, you can really follow this proposal for an experiment. And the only paper I have with Tony was much later. This is on some extension on this famous theorem by Mermin-Wagner. I don't know if David Mermin is still in the audience. And there's some kind of extension which came about when Tony myself met at some conference, I think it was in Waterloo, and totally challenged me on some of my theories, basically that this cannot be true. And then indeed we proved it cannot be true. In general, the theory was not wrong for finite size, but in the thermodynamic limit. And here I also had actually to work on Tony that he allowed me to put his name on the paper. Also, he started it and gave many inputs. So this is really, I can attest and confirm to this generosity. Now, coming to the heart of my talk, I want to present here some results on Majorana fermions. Also, Tony has been working on this very recently, and I will come at the end of my talk actually to some connection to, I hope, Tony's work. But first, I would like to introduce a little bit the subject. It has become very popular now, especially by big companies. Station Q by Microsoft is spending a lot of money in this area, and I would like to give you now a little bit of an overview where people stand. So, Majorana fermions, they have a long history, but I think it has been kindled by a paper by Kitaev around 15, 16 years ago. And here is a continuum version on this. Later I will come back to the Kitaev model. But here, the continuum version expressed in terms of the Bogoliubov-Duchenne equations basically is looking for a solution which is real. And particle hole symmetry basically then implies that the particle is its own antiparticle, as is written down here. Majoranas, when you move them around, they have the properties that they are non-abelian. So if you commute free commutations between free Majoranas, then there is a phase which is picked up because this essentially consists of a spinor with components, and when you move them around, they start to mix. And this has been proposed to be very useful for quantum computation because the Majorana state which you get here has a topological protection, as it is called in the system, namely that the ground state is degenerate, and this degeneracy is very stable. And local perturbation cannot lift that degeneracy. For example, here is a picture of two such Majoranas, Majorana wave functions, one on the left side of my system, on the right side of the system. This is a 1D topological P-wave superconductor, and the overlap here exponentially small means that the degeneracy is lifted only exponentially. And let's assume now for the moment that this is indeed the case, and then ask the question, how can we implement this in a real physical system? So here is the kind of recipe which is now the blueprint for everything which is done in the field, particular people around the world in Station Q. And the first experimental setup is sketched here by the group Leo Kovenhoven in Delft, and very similar structures now also by Charlie Marcus in Copenhagen. So you have an S-wave superconductor. You place on top of it a quasi one-dimensional wire, a nanowire, semiconducting material, and there are a few ingredients which you need to have on the list that this can work in the end. And from the semiconductor point of view, the most important ingredient is the spin-orbit interaction. So relativistic coupling between the spin and the momentum, giving you a spectrum like this. So for the spin up, you get a shift to the left, let's say, and the spin down, a shift to the right. Degeneracy is not lifted yet, so you have still Kramers pairs in the system. And the strength of the spin orbit can be measured then from the bottom of the band. And you would like to have this as large as possible, because you need to in the end tune the Fermi level into this crossing point. Typically, you might have a Fermi level which is very high up, and so you need many gates to pull down the Fermi level and tune it into this crossing here. Then, so you need a magnetic field in order to open a gap. And you can open the gap then also with a superconductor, and then there is a competition between these two gap opening mechanisms. So adding first the superconductor here gaps me the system out at the outer edges and at the inner Fermi points, and adding then the magnetic field will only lift the degeneracy at k equals 0. But it will compete now with superconductivity in this way, so the effective gap k equals 0 is the difference between Zeeman energy and the superconducting gap induced by the superconductor here. And tuning then the magnetic field, you close the gap, you reopen the gap, and when you reopen the gap, you hope that you are in a topological phase, and the Majoranas at the end of the wires will emerge. Good. So here again, definition of the Majorana. It's basically just a real part or the imaginary part of a fermion. And in this Bogoliubov-Deschênes representation, you have the wave function explicitly in these components, and they need to satisfy that the component for spin up with the component of the hole is essentially the same, and the opposite for the spin. And so analyzing then a system, so here's a typical wave function for a Majorana, in case you have never seen that, with the 4 components, spin up, spin down, hole, spin up, spin down, and decaying part. This is coming from the spectrum around k equals 0, and this part has support at the outer Fermi points and decays with another decay lengths here. And these decay lengths are essentially given by the effective gap induced here in the system, and alpha is the spin-orbit interaction. Good. So from this year, people were highly motivated to search for this in a mesoscopic structure, and here is a typical example from, I think this is from Covenhoven's group in Delft. And here is a nanowire underneath. This nanowire has a length of a few micrometers and diameter of 50 nanometers or so, indium and timonite. And it's hoped that there is some spin orbit in there. Similar stuff you can do with indium arsenide. In the cross-section, nowadays they have a hexagonal cross-section. You can grow these wires very precisely. And now it also, in recent years, it has become very fashionable to grow the superconductor, aluminum in this case, epitaxially on top of this wire. In order to have a very good contact, this epitaxial growth allows them to get a very strong proximity effect. That is the hope here. And at zero magnetic field, you see a very nice gap in transport measurement through the wire. And here is a set of data of the DI-dV characteristics as a function of the applied voltage, and here as a function of the magnetic field. And when you tune the magnetic field, then you see 2 lines coming together which merge at a certain field value and then stay at 0. And this is taken now as a signature of a Majorana zero energy, which sits in the spectrum, in the middle of the spectrum at 0 energy and more or less stays here. So the question now is that the only interpretation which is possible, and how convincing can that be? Just to show how complex the situation has become, so here, for example, this is from Leo Covenhoven's group, the latest experiment on the market, where there is a wire, and at the end of the wire there is artificially a quantum dot induced, and in this area there is no superconducting shell. So the green one stops here, the green epitaxial aluminum shell stops at this point. And there are 2 data sets, one which is interpreted as a Majorana bound state. This is this data here. This down here is theory simulation, and this one is interpreted as Aharonov-Bohm, as Andreev bound state, ABS here. And if you just go naively at this system, then it's very hard to see any differences. If you look at it and stare at it, you think, these are just 2 different devices. There are some slight differences. There's a third device, which they also show in the appendix of the paper. And in the third device, they did not find a quantum dot behavior at the end of the wire, and there is no zero bias peak. So no signature of an Andreev bound state or a Majorana bound state. And this was actually the kind of input which made us a little think, is this not a hint that there could actually be something else going on in the system? And this prompted us to look into the proximity effect, which I just added here, like everyone in the field added here, as an induced gap in the model, without thinking or asking how this gap actually comes about when you couple to a superconductor. So we started then to look into this in more detail. So I will go now for the next few minutes through some technical slides and tell you a little bit about the proximity effect. So the first thing one has to realize is in the cross-section of such a wire, the length scales are like this. So I have a height of my aluminum shell, which is much smaller than the diameter of the wire. Furthermore, the Fermi velocity in aluminum divided by this height here translated in energy gives about half an electron volt. That's about the level spacing which is created by this finite width of the superconductor. There is also a, so this is the height, and there is also width. And I will focus mostly now on the height, because the width type of quantization, which is much smaller, because the width here is 10 times or 50 times larger than the d, would also lead to levels, but they couple very weakly. I can give you more arguments later then about this. So anyway, here's the spectrum of the superconductor. The occupied subbands are black, and the red ones are the unoccupied ones. And you linearize around the Fermi point, and the level spacing there is, as indicated here, on the order of half an electron volt, which is much, much larger than the gap of the superconductor and the proximity gap. So it's a very large energy scale. The proximity gap here is less than a milli-electron volt. Another feature which we would like to understand here is maybe I should say that the height here is 10 nanometer, and 10 nanometer is much, much smaller than the coherence length in the superconductor, which is about a micrometer. And this already makes you think whether finite size effects of the superconductor could not have an important effect. And for this to test, one can actually also look at two wires connected by a superconductor and see whether there is some crosstalk or interference going on in the system. And there are many processes one needs to take into account, and a very important one, as it turns out later then, is a renormalization because of the intra-wire tunneling from the wire into superconductor and back. So what you do is technically within the Bogoliubov-Deschênes approach, basically you double the spectrum in number representation, you make the system immediately particle-hole symmetric, and write down your Hamiltonian for the wires, then the Hamiltonian for the superconductor, and then the tunneling between superconductor and wire. And here are these beasts. And we write down then the Bogoliubov transformation and diagonalize this set of equations. And the wire then just enters as a boundary condition of my bulk superconductor, or my finite size superconductor, and try to solve this analytically as far as one can go. It's a non-trivial problem, and also numerically. A second method which many people in the field used over the years is integrating out the superconductor, which formally is easy because you have a bilinear coupling between the superconductor and the wire, and the rest in BCS is quadratic. So this is the BCS Hamiltonian is quadratic, and this is the wire Hamiltonian, so you can integrate out the BCS, and your left them is an effective action of the wire system, which contains the self-energy, which contains the information of the superconductor. In all approaches so far in the literature, what people typically do is they assume bulk limit. And then this superconductor is assumed to be translationally invariant, and all boundary effects vanish. And that's a very subtle issue here, and very important not to do that and take into account then the boundary effects. So here, for example, is a solution of this finite size superconductor, where the information of the boundaries of the superconductor go in. And then the self-energy written down as close as to the standard form you can find in the literature can then be represented in a part which contains the gap, slightly renormalized, but also a self-energy shift, which is basically a band shift of my wire spectrum. And these beasts are written down here. So if you go back to the bulk limit, that basically means you neglect the back action of the wire on the superconductor. It's not only the superconductor induces proximity, but also the wire can act back on the superconductor and feel the boundary conditions. And this is what people have used so far, standard, and that is only valid if the height of or the size of my superconductor exceeds the coherence length. And in this system, this is definitely not the case. So to give you a little bit more pictorial account of this is, so let's look at the spectrum of the nanowire. So there is one band taken out here, and the one of the superconductor. So they have different masses. It's not to scale. but just to demonstrate. And in the superconductor, I have a gap here at the Fermi point and a gap here. And I would like, by tunnel coupling the superconductor to the wire, open a gap at the Fermi point in the wire. But now you see, because of this large level separation in the superconductor, because of its finite size, typically I will not be close to this point. And that means there is an energy mismatch from the coupling down to this point to open a gap. And that means I need a very large coupling in order to get a sizable gap. And only by accident, if this band would be close, sliding down here to this point, I might get some resonant opening of the gap. And the other levels, they do not couple much. So here is the solution then of this, just by solving the equations analytically and plot them as a function of the momentum along the wire and the spectrum in terms of the gap. And you can see if there is no coupling, so gamma is the coupling rate, tunneling square times density of states. If this is 0, then we get no gap in the wire. Here's the superconductor spectrum. We open up the tunneling and we get a small gap. And you have to go to a very large tunnel coupling, about 1,000 times the proximity gap, in order to get a sizable gap in the wire. And here, in terms of gap as a function of kf, you see these resonances. If you just happen to be very close to one of the band crossings in the wire, then you get a good gap. Otherwise, you get small gaps. And you need to go to very large coupling between the wire and the superconductor in order to have a sizable gap induced in the wire. It gets a little bit better when you go to the limit when the size, the height here, is larger than xi, but this means you have to go now really to 1 micrometer for aluminum. And the reason why people have chosen aluminum and a small film is because you have to apply a magnetic field in plane in the axis, along the axis of the wire, and you would like to keep the field penetrating the superconductor as small as possible. So it's actually no option to really make it very thick, because then you kill the superconductor immediately. It's already now at a very low field. And also, what we learned from here is that there is a very strong kind of coherence of the wire with the superconductor. So here is a plot of the Fermi momentum, or as a function of distance, you could say, this size of the superconductor. When you look at the gap in the wire, that this oscillates very strongly. It's oscillations on the scale of the Fermi wavelengths in the superconductor, which is small. But still, what you can see is that the wire is actually never really a true one-dimensional system. It's coherent up to the correlation length inside the superconductor. And just thinking of integrating that thing out and having a one-dimensional system is not the right picture. If you have two wires, then they talk to each other by so-called crossed Andreev pairing, which is a very important process in order to generate all kinds of gaps, also in quantum Hall edge states. And it turns out that this is a very subtle effect as well. Also interference here. And for example, you can, in this problem, you can solve them, and you see that they actually interfere destructively. It's also a surprising result here, and in the end, you get a total sum of this. Okay, so now if you ask the question, I have this very large gap I would like to have in the semiconductor. I see that I get as large as the gap as large as the one in the superconductor, so that means I need a very strong coupling. And according to the calculation, we get a very large band shift associated with that. And if you look then at the topological criterion, how big is my magnetic field I need to apply in order to go into topological phase, then it becomes unphysically large. That's Tesla. So it's impossible to get a magnetic field and still keep the superconducting phase of the parent superconductor. That's kind of the first message which we got. Now, this was for the kind of 1D wire, and now people also have moved to two-dimensional electron gases, indium arsenide with an aluminum shell on top of it, and very similar setups. For example, that's now one of the blueprints of a Majorana qubit or Majorana setup at Microsoft Station Q. So you have an indium arsenide electron gas, aluminum epitaxial grown like this here that defines a wire underneath, and the hope is that you will find then some Majoranas here and here. And here again, proximity can be modeled. We did this, for example, with this type binding calculation. Let me jump now a little bit to the results. And here, this summarizes similar results as I described before. So here is the gap in the wire, scaled versus delta. And if you want to go something on the order of delta, delta is the gap in the superconductor, you need to turn on the coupling, the tunnel coupling between the wire and the superconductor to a strength, let's say, a quarter or a tenth of the Fermi energy in the superconductor itself, and then you get a sizable gap. And if we take this as an input for our coupling parameter, so we want to, we know from the experiment, we have about this delta, this gives us a value of t, and if we use then this value of t and look at other parameters in the wire, we see that, for example, the band mass of the wire gets renormalized back to the electron bond. The spin orbit energy, if you have one to begin with in the wire, vanishes. You get huge band shifts, so these are the lowest 4 bands, and they all get shifted very strongly. It's on the scale of a few hundred milli-electron volts. And the scale to tune is the spin orbit, which is 1 milli-electron volt. So you're really out of phase, and the G factor also scales down to the metallic one. So in other words, you metallize your semiconductor. The coupling is so strong, you want to have a large gap. The price you pay is that all other properties also become very metallic-like. So it's just to illustrate this, what happens with the wire. The contacts are actually just too good. You can add disorder, surface roughness, and so forth. It doesn't change much. The same statement as before remains. Now, let me skip that. The only way out of this is basically saying that you need to introduce some intermediate insulating layer to reduce now this coupling. Otherwise, I think it's almost impossible to get any regime where you have a topological phase. So coming back to this picture, basically we think that the experiments are consistent with this statement that the superconducting shell has metallized the wires. And if you have no quantum dot, you see nothing because there's really no topological phase in your wire. And if you have a quantum dot, you just see an Andreev bound state which moves with the magnetic field. And there is little hope that there is actually some Majorana bound state in there. Good. So now, for the last few minutes, I would like to zoom in on some other questions. So this is now kind of speculative. So this is very early in the work. I hope actually to present more here, but it's very difficult even to ask the right question. And the difficulty arises in the following way. So we have here the simplest possible model of a p-wave superconductor, spinless fermion, with nearest neighbor p-wave pairing, as is written down here. So we have this nearest neighbor pairing here. And this is just a transverse easing model, and has been studied by Lieb, Schulz, and Mattis many, many years ago. And everything in terms of analytical solutions was known in that paper in '61. And also the boundary solutions were known, the Majoranas were known. They were just not called Majoranas, but you can find the explicit solutions of the wave functions in that paper. And Kitaev pointed out then that in this model you can have what I described before. In this chain model, when you change the basis, you go from this complex fermion to a real and imaginary part, which you can call Majoranas, and then recast the Hamiltonian in terms of these Majoranas. And under these conditions, when the parameter delta and t, the hopping, are equal and the chemical potential is 0, you get a very simple Hamiltonian where the first Majorana on the left-hand side and the last one on the right-hand side drop out of the Hamiltonian. And so they have 0 energy. And these 2 Majoranas, they can be taken back then to form a complex fermion in this way. And that commutes with the Hamiltonian. It's not part of the Hamiltonian, therefore it's a 0 mode. And it's this occupation of the 0 mode which people propose then to use as a qubit. If it's not loaded, the fermion, it's a 0. If it's loaded, it's a 1. There are some issues now with superposition of parity. I will not address this right now. Maybe I come to this later. But for the moment, we could say, okay, does this form a qubit? And very important for this is that we have degeneracy. That we have degeneracy between no fermion in there and degeneracy and the same energy when I have a fermion loaded in the system. And now this degeneracy, that's what is referred to as a topological feature of the system, this protection of the degeneracy. Is it really true? Because here, that's a model which basically is a Bogoliubov-Deschênes type of superconductor where particle-hole symmetry and mean field has already been applied. And we are asking now about 1 over n effects, and is now the mean field description still okay? And this question was asked by Tony many years back in 2010. That's when I also, I think, learned about this, and Tony visited in Basel and told me about this conference proceeding he wrote. And it's actually a footnote in this conference proceeding where Tony says, well, he has written up all this here as a model to discuss the effect of particle conservation, and then only realized later that people were talking about this model, the Kitaev model, for quite a few years. So it's actually, one should call it also a Leggett model if you add the Kitaev name to this model. And Tony really added one additional feature here, namely this Cooper pair in the bath, which is an improved mean field approximation, which should ensure particle number conservation. And just last week, I saw this paper. It's a paper of almost 40 pages. I haven't digested it yet, so I will not say much about it because I'm sure I will say wrong things. And but here they have discussed this in great more detail. And I think some of the conclusion in the end is that the degeneracy might not be exponentially protected. It might be power law protected. Now, we had a slightly different kind of angle. Maybe it's the same, you can tell me. And I would like to sketch this now, this picture. So the usual interpretation in the model is that we have here a system at 0 temperature which has n particles filled into the system, and then we apply a mean field approximation, and the mean field approximation just opens a gap, and I get this particle hole spectrum as written down here. But the important thing is that the 0, which is defined by the chemical potential at the n particle level, is the same. But now what happens if I do not perform first the mean field approximation, but I just add first the particle to my system before I do the mean field approximation? And very naturally you would say, well, if I add one particle more to my system, I will change the Fermi level. Let's say I have spinless electrons in my system here, so I will go one level higher. And I get a new Fermi level for m+1 particles. And now if I start from this system and apply the mean field approximation, then I will open a gap around this level, and I will have now a shifted level to the level of this procedure here, which will be a 1 over n correction, or a size correction 1 over L. Definitely, it will not be an exponential correction because the quantization of my system is 1 over L. And there is no way I can escape that. I could make my system as long as I want. If I want to have my Majorana in a finite environment, I need actually to close the system such that my Majoranas stay inside this finite size region. So you can go now one step further and see then. So basically we get the ground state energy where we have no fermion or 0 fermion occupation at the Majorana level. And I could say now, okay, I don't know which procedure is actually correct. Should I just go with the energy argument and say, okay, if mean field provides me with a energy which is definitely lower than the one where I change first the chemical potential, and then I would say, okay, the mean field is this one, and I will get an occupied state at the Fermi level with lower energy, and that's the energy which is occupied. But if I buy that argument, then I can actually go further, one step lower in a particle number, because I also need a degeneracy between 1 and 0. But then I'm in principle with 1 fermion less. And when I have 1 fermion less, I will actually go then to a chemical potential in lower energy, which is by 1 particle less, and fill that particle into the 0 energy of the Majorana. So the upshot of this is that in the end, I will always end up with an energy where the Majorana is filled, the lower energy state. So I cannot really get a degeneracy between the 0 and the 1. The problem with all these arguments are that the Bogoliubov-Dechaine is a theory where particle number is not conserved. And therefore, when we add a particle, basically we change the parity. We should always consider it as a coherent superposition of a particle n plus 1 and n minus 1 if you go to n. And I think that's one of the difficulties in the problem. But it's a difficulty which is coming from the approximation. And because we are looking for something which is a 1 over n correction on the entire system, we should also ask what the fluctuations are doing and pay more attention to these finite size corrections. Of course, you can fine-tune the chemical potential, and if you have a certain width, because coupling to the reservoir, then it's possible to get degeneracy, but that would be fine-tuning, and that would not be very stable. If you extend it to a real qubit where you need 4 Majoranas in order to keep parity constant in the total system, then you can also convince yourself there are other issues with charging energy, whether you have a fermion here or here. This will change locally the charging energy and will lead then also to differences in that respect. Okay, with this I come to my conclusions. So I have talked about this proximity effect, and there seems to be some real issues with metallization of nanowires, and hopefully ask some not so stupid questions about this topological protection. I would also come now to an end and wish you, happy birthday, Tony, and many more springs in condensed matter physics and beyond. And kind as a symbol, I thought, from Switzerland, what can I bring? And there's chocolate, and this is a bunny, which is a kind of a symbol for spring and life in general. And I wish you many, many more. And congratulations, Tony.
Okay, thank you. We have maybe time for one quick question, if there's one.
So, here is the and the real chocolate.
There was an experiment simultaneously with the Delft one, so on missing Shapiro steps. And wouldn't it be kind of more convincing, so this type of experiment to demonstrate that these are Majoranas? This was a niobium superconductor and indium antimonide coax.
So you mean Rokinson's experiment? Well, in principle, also the Shapiro step, the missing Shapiro steps, they do have alternative interpretations. And so here I have, I haven't really zeroed in too much on all the possibilities or all the experiments which have been performed. But I think so far, every experiment has focused only on one particular feature. And for example, here in these wires, the most desirable experiment would be a correlated measurement, that you try to measure the Majorana on this end of the wire simultaneously with the Majorana on this end of the wire. So for example, if you apply magnetic field, then both Majoranas, they should change, and they might overlap, and if you have local probes there, you should see this simultaneously. People have tried these experiments, but so far failed. There was never a correlation seen. And I think, if something like this would come, this would lend much more kind of belief that indeed there is this state in there.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you. Let's thank Professor Loss again.
maybe put it here. I've got them on.
Your glasses, I don't know. So there's a clicker if you want to use it. Just
Oh, how does that work?
Yep, just click that. Do you want to point it to?
Yeah, actually the pointer is much more important. Thanks.
Is there a pointer?
Oh, thanks, Nigel.
Okay, great. For our last talk of this session, we have Professor Philip Stamp from the University of British Columbia, and he's going to talk about quantum gravity in the lab.
Okay, well, can everybody hear me properly? Yes. Obviously not. Okay. So I'm extraordinarily pleased to be able to come here to what's obviously, what is clearly a remarkable occasion. I mean, it's certainly been that so far. So I'm going to talk about something which is perhaps a little further away from what Tony has been involved in over the years, but as you'll see, it's not quite as far away as you might think. This is a picture of where I normally work in the winter. This is where the university is. However, I've decided to take a summer holiday here. Part of my sabbatical is in New Zealand, quite different view. I've actually known Tony for quite a long time. It seems I'm one of the few people here who knew him at Sussex as opposed to Urbana, and I'll say a little bit about that in this talk. The subject of the talk is the possibility that it might be able to test ideas of quantum gravity in the lab, and in particular to test ideas about the breakdown of quantum mechanics caused by gravity in the lab. This work has been done with the following people, and there's a number of papers. It'll perhaps amuse you that there's a whole group of people who are having these papers circulated, and this one has been called the BCS Prime paper by a number of them, and then this one here is called BS. Let me just start by setting the scene. I'll try and keep this talk to 30 minutes. It's generally accepted that there are two theories in physics right now, both of which work extraordinarily well. In fact, they've both been tested very extensively, and neither of them has yet been found wanting. One of them, of course, is quantum mechanics that everybody knows about, and the other is general relativity. We're supposed to throw out questions for the audience, so I'm going to throw one out already. The idea of a test of a theory when the theory doesn't involve direct experimental manipulation, but instead involves only observations, is rather different from what one is used to in condensed matter physics. But I think that any reasonable look at what we now know about black holes makes it clear that their existence has been established, I think, to pretty much the same confidence as, say, superfluidity in helium-3. And in fact, in some ways, I would claim that we're farther away in the chain of logical deduction from helium-3 than we are from black holes. There's an extraordinary amount of, there's an extraordinarily long chain of inference and deduction that goes on between an experiment at 1 millikelvin and what we see in a lab, which I don't think is the case with, for example, the recent observations of gravitational waves. Okay, now I'm going to dive straight in here, and I'm assuming that most people neither know much nor even care very much about quantum gravity. So I'm going to try and, the style of this talk is that there will be some people who want to see all the formal details, and so I'm putting them up. But you don't have to read them. I'm going to try and describe the general ideas here without doing that. Now, for reasons which I'll explain, what I'm going to talk about now is going to be couched in the language of path integrals. So I'll just remind you that we're usually taught at some point that we should think about quantum mechanics in terms of a propagator between, in this case, two space-time points, which is given by a weighted sum over all paths between those points. And if we have to deal with the propagation of some field configuration, a gauge field configuration, then we're propagating between two configurations. The only catch here is that there's a factor here which is called the Faddeev-Popov determinant, which is supposed to take care of the fact that there are many gauge equivalent configurations corresponding to one physical configuration. Something that's often not talked about in the literature is you're actually supposed to define the measure of these configurations. And when one comes to gravity, that turns out to be non-trivial. So the same sort of propagator here, in the case the weighting involves an action for the matter. This is for a single particle. But we also have another one of these factors, but it is a rather peculiar measure here because it involves the field itself. So it's not even diffeomorphism invariant. And the action is actually rather peculiar. The first term here is the standard Einstein action, written in terms of a metric density. And the really important thing that you learn, if you compare this with what we're mostly used to in condensed matter physics, is that it's extremely nonlinear. So there are many ways you can speak about this physically. A very nice one is you imagine two pulses, delta function pulses of gravitational waves. So we're just imagining two sheets in which there's gravitational energy, and the space-time is completely flat between them. But the superposition principle is extremely badly violated for this system. So the energy of these two pulses depends very strongly on the distance between them. So it's sometimes said by people in classical gravity that the superposition principle is so badly violated that it doesn't make sense to talk about individual systems anymore, and you can't define a local energy at all in general relativity. So what this means is that there are all sorts of funny problems that come up when you try and quantize this. One has, for example, the problem of causality. Normally, in any field theory written on flat space-time, you can't have physical effects propagating well outside the light cone. The problem is which means that this commutator here has to go zero for space-like intervals. But the problem in gravity is that if you define a sum over different configurations of the metric, then two events can be separated by space-like intervals for one configuration and time-like for another, which makes it impossible to define causal relationships between these events. And for this reason, actually many people in gravity reject entirely the idea that one should do this sort of thing. One example of this is of such a person as Roger Penrose. Another is Bob Wald. Just to give two examples of people that I've talked about this with. Now, there are other problems which have been mentioned. I don't think I'm going to go through them. There's the measurement problem, which I'm going to come to in a minute in a more down-to-earth way. Another is the black hole information paradox, which was mentioned before. There's really no agreement on this. But to bring us to a more familiar ground, that of non-relativistic quantum mechanics, many of the problems, as we'll see, that people discuss in quantum gravity actually have to do with ordinary quantum mechanics. So let me remind you of the problems that people have talked about. One is the Schrodinger's cat paradox. I don't think I have to go through that. But if we ask what this means for the wave function, well, you find sharp differences between different people. Some will at the bottom of their hearts, believe that somehow the wave function does say something real about the world. But then they run into all sorts of objections, such as the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. But others will argue that it represents nothing more than our information about the world. This also leads to problems because different observers will assign different wave functions. So the wave function is a problem when you start asking fundamental questions in quantum mechanics. And so are measurements, and Tony, of course, has made both of these problems famous. Another problem which is more relevant to gravity is the problem of boundary conditions. But this even exists in ordinary quantum mechanics. In particular, we assign a central role to experimental observers who impose time asymmetry. One of the many reasons why it's useful to look at things with path integrals is you do things more globally. But all of this is very peculiar, and I think, again, some of us at the bottom of our hearts feel that this just is so anthropocentric that it seems almost medieval. And this is hard to get used to when you're an undergraduate. And Bell summed this up by saying that to restrict quantum mechanics to be exclusively about piddling laboratory operations is to betray the great enterprise. A serious formulation will not exclude the big world outside the lab. Well, of course, quantum gravity tries to deal with that world, but it faces the problem that quantum mechanics works very well. And so many physicists will get very annoyed with you when you show them a slide like this. And particularly, they don't like to be called medieval. Now, in the string theory community and in part of the quantum gravity community, one again encounters the idea that quantum mechanics is okay, and that really the only problems that one has in quantizing gravity arise at very high energies, near the Planck mass. There are various arguments about this, which I don't want to go through, but the general idea is that, gravity is just an effective theory, that is classical gravity, which will emerge somehow from a quantum theory of gravity and possibly a string theory once we finally find those. But in fact, there's been a long list of people who have actually objected to the problems, well, who have objected to quantum mechanics and the attempt to fuse it with general relativity on low energy grounds. That is to say, they've pointed out that there's a problem which has nothing to do with high energies. The first person that's normally credited with this observation is Feynman. And then lots of people since then. And the papers that I've found most interesting are these papers by Kibble and co-workers and also by Penrose. So let me just summarize their problem. Imagine that we're dealing with a two-slit experiment here. Now, if we include gravity, we have to include in the superposition not just the matter part of the wave function, but also the space-time metric. So we'll have two different metrics because the space-time metric is sensitive to the position, or to the path, in fact, of the object here. In a non-relativistic treatment, this seems to be okay because we take the inner product with the real space vector, and then the inner product, sorry, and then when we take the interference term, well, this is what it is. We know this very well, but there's a formal problem here. If we include the metric as well, then we're actually trying to take the inner product of two different metrics. But we can't relate these mathematically. There's no formal meaning to this inner product because mathematically they exist on two different manifolds, and if we think about it physically, they don't even have the same vacuum. So this is, if you like, a formal problem. And the physical problem is that basically, if we start talking about wave function collapses, and we take this seriously, then the changes in the metric caused by a collapse lead to development of singularities in space-time, which is pretty hard to take. The idea that when we do a two-slit experiment, we're actually causing singularities to appear in space-time. Now, you might argue that these are small, but it was, as was already pointed out by Andrew Briggs yesterday, not necessarily even in the lab. And we'll come to that. Now, these points were actually made a long time ago. By Einstein. These are later in his life where he was addressing the implications of superpositions of a mass in two states that were separated by time-like intervals. I'm not going to go through this, but I think these are a very nice summary in language of 1949 of what I just said in more recent language. Okay, so I remember very well walking down the corridor of the 5th floor in the MAPS building in Sussex University, having just read an article in Phys Letters, which was a comment. Sorry, it was a paper in Phys Letters, which was actually discussing work by Tony, but he'd never seen it. And I remember asking him. I ran into him in the corridor, and as usual, he was in a hurry, but as usual, he was always ready to talk. And so I said, "Have you seen this article?" Which was, in effect, a 4-page comment on a Phys letter that he'd written with Amir Caldera. Caldera I didn't know because he'd actually left Sussex before I arrived, but anyway, I was quite surprised to be ushered into his office to discuss this, and then to see in my mailbox later in the afternoon a comment on this paper. And that was how I first learned about this paper, which had been published just before I actually started my graduate work. And this paper has always fascinated me. I think probably many of you are familiar with it. It asks, amongst other things, how one can define what I think nowadays is called macroscopicity or some awful word like that, but which Tony called disconnectivity, and which we would now think of as essentially a measure of how large was the degree of entanglement between two states. He's returned to this theme many times. Here's a more recent effort. And so now I'm going to throw out another question which is relevant to the topic of this talk, which is actually, to what level have we tested quantum mechanics at the macroscopic level? And there is actually some discussion of this in the literature. For example, the group surrounding Brigitte Royle has attempted to give a measure to sort of disconnectivity for 3 of the experiments done on macroscopic coherence in squids. And the numbers they came up with were actually rather small. The largest was 5,750 for the number of, if you in colloquial language, entangled Cooper pairs. At the same time, people have been doing 2-slit experiments with masses in Vienna, and the largest mass that they've been able to show 2-slit interference for is 10 to the 5 hydrogen masses. Well, if these numbers are correct, and I suspect that Tony will disagree with at least some of them, then quantum mechanics has actually not been tested at all at the macroscopic level. So my second question is, has it been tested at the macroscopic level? I hope that that will be on the list of questions that we'll see. Okay, now why is this relevant to what I'm talking about? Well, gravity has been tested at the macroscopic level and found to be classical. We don't know what happens when you go to masses below the Planck mass, and the Planck mass is much, much bigger than these masses here. It's 2 times 10 to the minus 5 grams. An object of that size, well, if you, in Paris they've made mirrors of that size because they're interested in testing these problems. Those mirrors are made of essentially silicon nitride. They're 1 millimeter long, and they're triangular in shape with a side of 0.25 millimeters. So they're big. So we have a problem here. We have a classical theory of gravity which works. We have which apparently describes macroscopic objects very well. We have a quantum mechanics which describes microscopic theory very well. It's not clear yet that there's an overlap, but what is sure, and that's what I tried to explain at the beginning, is that they seem to have a strong incompatibility even at low energies. And so if one tries to find a theory of quantum gravity, one has to somehow retain the desirable features of both and get rid of the undesirable features, and hopefully the result will be satisfactory. But it's actually quite difficult to modify these 2 theories, and it's even more difficult to make something which is consistent. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a bit about a theory which actually is internally consistent. We've established that it is, which is neither quantum mechanics nor classical gravity. So I want to play a little game here. Imagine that we take the propagator for a particle, but now we ask what happens if we allow correlations between the different paths. Now we can write this as a sum. We can say, well, let's sum over terms where paths and path integral are not correlated, and now there'll be a term where pairs of paths are correlated, and then triplets of paths, and so on. And this is merely a mathematical game. I mean, you can write it, and if the coefficients involved in the 2-path, 3-path, and so forth correlations are arbitrary, then you've basically got something that's extremely general, but also completely unspecific. But then you introduce the physical hypothesis, which is that the correlations are actually engineered by gravity itself. And in general relativity, a special role falls to the space-time metric field because of the principle of equivalence. And so the idea here is that this is the fundamental physical reason for that. Now, I could give a long discussion of other arguments for that choice, but I don't have time. And one finds then that there are two kinds of theories that you can write like this. One of them is what we call the summation version. I'm just going to give you an idea of what this is. Okay? In the summation version, in order to engineer these correlations between paths, so you see we're summing over, n here is simply telling us whether we're dealing with, for example, if n equals 2, we're looking at correlations between pairs of paths. And the correlations are engineered here by the functional integration over the gravitational field. And the reason is that because of the equivalence principle, the matter action inevitably has a dependence on the metric. And it's in a very precise way, which comes from the principle of equivalence. And you can't avoid this. And so the moment we do this functional integral in this way, then we get correlations between the paths. Now, it's very dangerous to start doing diagrammatic expansions in quantum gravity because, as I said, it's highly nonlinear. For people in condensed matter physics, imagine that you had anharmonic interactions between phonons, but that the higher couplings were just as important, as, in fact, even more important than the lower ones. So 18 phonon interactions were more important than 2 phonon interactions, for example. If you do a naive perturbation expansion in the metric density, that's what you find. But it's actually useful to draw diagrams to show what is the difference between this theory and ordinary quantum gravity. So this is ordinary quantum gravity. This kappa here is simply telling you about all correlations for a single particle, say, or field. These are actually these are diagrams for the generating functional, for those who are interested in the details, which can be written in a ring form. This is, for those of you who know, it's like Keldysh or Schwinger-DeWitt diagrams where you join the in parts with a circuit around the temperature cylinder. Anyway, this term here is telling you about correlations between paths. Now, the moment you have such correlations, the superposition principle is gone. Okay? It's really important to understand that. These are not conventional Feynman diagrams because these diagrams violate the superposition principle. They're telling you that you have correlations between paths, whereas the superposition principle tells you that you don't. And so when you, for example, write down propagators, you find that you get very strange diagrams. This would be a propagator with no gravitation, but here you can have gravitational correlations between paths and so on. That's the summation version. The product version is essentially like summing not over terms in the partition function, but terms in the log of the partition function. So now we actually have a product over these terms. And I'm not going to say any more than that because of time. Now, the interesting thing is that you can apply, and it's a very lengthy process, but you can investigate the consistency of these theories. This is the subject of the BCS prime and the BS paper, which basically are something like 56 pages of PhysRevD. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but what you find is that the summation form actually doesn't pass all of these tests, whereas the product form does. Now, these are consistency tests for theories that have been evolved over the years in both particle physics and in quantum gravity, using prescriptions, for example, that were devised by Fradkin, Batalin, and Vilkovitsky, and they're very powerful. And so we're quite pleased that the product form is a consistent theory. And this is the first goal here that we were talking about. We would like to find a theory which, in a certain sense, does unify general relativity and quantum field theory, which gets past the problems that I was mentioning and which is consistent. Now I'd like to give you a feeling for what it actually does, because it predicts phenomena which, if seen, would quite definitely show a violation of quantum mechanics caused by gravity. Now we have to learn how to use this theory, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but for lab-based experiments on Earth, we can actually do perturbation expansions in gravitons. I won't talk about the formal details. The way you do that, of course, is you expand about a flat space-time in the parameter lambda, which is basically 1 over the Planck mass. H mu nu is in a small deviation of the space-time metric from flat space, and away you go. Now, supposing we asked how a single particle propagates in a theory like this. Now, we all know that a single particle, like an electron, when passing through a two-slit system, shows interference, and we're taught by, for example, Feynman lectures in Physics Volume 3 how that's supposed to work. But here, the lowest graph, which is going to cause deviations from that, has gravitational interactions between the two paths in an interference experiment. And we can imagine that this experiment is being done at low velocities. And so we can do, in this case, this graph is actually nothing more nor less than the Newtonian interaction. And these higher terms actually give both Schwarzschild and quantum corrections to that. Now, there's a very simple way of looking at this physically. What I'm going to show you is that it leads to what I call a path bunching effect, where it's hard to pull paths away from each other because this interaction is attractive. Let's look at the following picture. Now, this picture is telling us what happens at the lowest order in perturbation theory when you consider the interactions between paths. In this case, it turns out that we can think of this in Schrodinger terms because what we are looking at is a problem of two paths interacting via Newtonian interaction, and we can rewrite that in terms of a differential equation. The potential is the Newtonian attractive potential. Here it is, between the masses on each path, which are, of course, the mass of the particle. Now, what happens when you increase the mass? Well, the potential well gets deeper. You see that there is, of course, a bound state inside this potential well, and as the mass increases, that bound state has an energy which gets lower and lower. So we have a binding energy, analogous to the binding energy of an electron in a Coulomb potential, and we also have a spread of the wave function, which, when we go back to the path language, is telling you the typical distance apart of these paths. Provided that there's no other energy involved, no other perturbation involved. Now, it's interesting to look at how this binding energy, E sub 0, and this length scale, which is essentially the size of the ground state, if you like, it's the distance between paths. It's interesting to see how these vary with the mass of the particle. So this binding energy goes like it goes like the mass of the particle to the 5th power. It gets fast. It gets big very fast as you increase the mass. So this is just an energy scale. The radius of this, the analog of the Bohr radius for the Coulomb potential, goes like 1 over the mass of the particle cubed. So in other words, as we increase the mass, the length scale crashes down and the energy scale shoots up. Rather than have you stare at these two figures, I'm going to illustrate the results by considering, you can do all this for n particles, so for a solid system, and you end up getting corrections, strong corrections to the results, which can be parameterized in terms of the phonon spectrum of the system. I won't go into that. Oh, sorry. Let me jump ahead here. This is if you like, a rehearsal of how these two scales, the energy scale and the length scale, vary. Let's take an electron first. The length scale is 3.6 million Hubble radii. It's very big. And the energy scale is 10 to the minus 84 electron volts. Very small. In other words, this term, if you like, these correlations, these gravitational correlations, are of no interest whatsoever for the electron. If the universe was billions of times larger than it is now, and if there was nothing in that universe but an electron, this tells us that that electron would not be able to spread out over more than 3.6 million Hubble radii. For a hydrogen atom, it's a lot bigger, the energy scale, and the length scale is, well, it's still very large. So let's keep on going down to the HIV virus, and eventually we get to human sperm. And now we find that the energy scale is 156 Kelvin. It's come up by 88 orders of magnitude. The length scale is 10 to the minus 17 meters. And all of a sudden, and this is, I think, the point that Andrew was making, but in a somewhat different context, gravitational effects are not as trivial as you might think when you start to consider what might happen in a breakdown of quantum mechanics caused by gravity. So for an object this size, the paths are forced together. In fact, they're bound together over a very short length scale by an energy of order 156 Kelvin. And if you keep on raising the mass, then that energy gets very big. Now, I got into a big argument with Anton Zeilinger, and I suspect lots of you have too, because he's a very firm believer in the information theoretic interpretation of the wave function. That's the reason for these slides. And it just occurred to me before I gave this talk that I should have redone this as the L to M. And L would have been Leggett and M Merman. And we'll see why, because in this case there's entanglement between these two macroscopic objects. When one of them's happy, the other one is. But when one of them is sad, the other one is. Or if you like, angry. Anton gave me this angry photo. We can also consider superpositions of angry and happy. And I suspect that in the case of, judging from what I heard yesterday, in the case of Leggett and Merman, there would be an anti-correlation. That is to say, when we had a happy L, we would have an angry M and vice versa. But the basic idea is the same. If I can get hold of photos of them, I'll change this. Anyway, the question is, whether this state or this state is meaningful. And I don't believe anyone who tells me that they think it is. I simply don't believe it. Not Anton, not anyone. We just don't take such states seriously. But the question is, when does this break down? And the answer given in this theory is that it breaks down on mass scales of order the human sperm. Now, and the crossover is very rapid in this perturbation treatment. The problem of dealing with it non-perturbatively we haven't solved yet. So this is not a decoherence mechanism. This is not an environmental decoherence mechanism at all. There's no absorption of information or information loss involved. All that's happening here is there's a change in the dynamics. I won't discuss this. The most obvious way to test this experimentally was devised by, a number of people. There's experiments going on in a number of places now involving oscillators. And the idea here is that you engineer superpositions of states involving two different positions of a single oscillator. But the same kind of arguments can be made, and the same principle applies, that if the mass of the oscillator is above this crossover mass, then you won't be able to make those superpositions. You won't be able to observe them. And, well, I'm not going to say too much about the experiments because it's not what I do, but here's an example of one such experiment. It was actually the first one to be proposed of this kind. You imagine, and this was proposed by Baumeister and company, including Roger Penrose, you imagine that we allow a photon to be in a superposition of states in which it's either in this cavity or this cavity. But this cavity has a little mirror, which is on a spring and can be pushed back if the photon is in there. And it's easy to engineer Schrodinger cat superpositions with the photon either in this cavity or this cavity, which means that the mirror will be in a superposition of two different position states, and then you can vary the mass. And other designs are being built. These are my collaborators here. I'd like to thank in particular Andrei Barvinsky, who is a very well-known theorist in quantum gravity and in cosmology in Moscow. But actually, the style in this field is very different, I've found, from any other field I've ever worked in, because people love to circulate papers before they're even finished and criticize them. And in fact, this group of people has been doing this with the papers that I mentioned. Serge Renaud is an experimentalist in Paris. Franck Lallouet is more interested in the philosophical aspects, as is Harvey Brown, and these others are professional gravitational field theorists. And so I'd thank all of these people. And then finally, I'd like to thank Tony, because although I haven't had a chance to say why, if it hadn't been for him and for one other person whom probably almost none of you know, named Frank Moss, who was at one time at the University of Missouri St. Louis, I would certainly not have stayed in physics. Since everybody's throwing around photos of Tony, I thought I'd show two. This is where this is the only one of two occasions where I ever saw him wear a suit. The other one being his inaugural address. Sorry? Oh, great. Number 3. I'll bring my camera. Anyway, the other one was his inaugural address at Sussex University. This was when he received an honorary degree at UBC. And this is a photo. There's a photo of Tony talking to a young girl. Actually, this is with my kids, and you'll never actually guess what he's doing here. So this is my children at one time, like many, were interested in Pokemon cards. But the interesting thing about these is they're all in Japanese. And so he was actually translating everything on these cards for them. It took a long time. And well, it wasn't physics, but it was much more interesting, I suspect, to them than whether or not the moon is there when they don't look. Thank you very much, Tony. It's been a long and wonderful ride.
Okay, any last minute questions before we close the session? Mike?
So this seems to, the nonlinearity, to lead to macroscopic collapse. But there's no randomness in it.
Correct.
So, the usual macroscopic excuses for measurement put in randomness by
Right.
plan.
Yes.
How do you get
Okay.
statistics?
So at this point, all the people in Oxford tell me that I'm a secret many worlds believer. Because at no point in this analysis does one actually invoke measurements. I haven't done it. I actually have extra slides, if you're interested, which discuss how one implements the measurement operation here. But basically, it just becomes another part of the system. And so what you have is these branches, which either communicate or not, depending on the mass involved, are all involved, okay? But the key difference between quantum mechanics in the many worlds formulation is that when they're sufficiently large, they don't communicate, okay? And so from that point of view, it's like many worlds in that we're on one of these branches. but it's unlike many worlds in that we simply are not able, there's no conceivable way that they can interact with any other. So if you like, there are many worlds, but we're only on one of them.
If you try to project this onto ordinary quantum mechanics as a correction, would there be a splitting that depends on the measure of the component of the wave function?
Sorry, are you using the word measure in a...
In the ordinary way.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Right. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I got confused by when you used the term measure.
Okay, for the sake of not completely destroying the schedule, let's stop now, and then Tony and ask questions right afterwards. Okay, all right, okay. I guess I could...
Question. You mentioned the argument of Corsbachen.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
I actually have a counter-argument which shows that if you apply the Corsbachen criterion to two states of the smallest dust particle one can see with the naked eye, one stationary and the other moving over its own diameter in 1 second, say, which I think most people would agree is macroscopic.
Yes, of course.
The Corsbachen number is actually smaller.
Okay,
for that.
I would really like to see that because that, of course, is directly relevant to this because we're dealing here with superpositions of states in different positions.
Okay, I can give you, it's actually published now.
Oh, is it? I don't know about this. Okay, great.
Okay, let's thank Professor Stamp again.